15 unique bourbon distilleries within 45 miles of downtown. That's what you can expect in Lexington, Kentucky, the bourbon lover's ultimate playground. Lexington is the perfect hub for your bourbon-infused vacation, and VisitLEX will help you create the perfect itinerary along the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. For more information, go to visitlex.com, that's VisitLEX.com, and discover all the ways to enjoy the horse and, in our opinion, bourbon, capital of the world.
With Liquor Barn, you can shop your favorite bourbon, that perfect bottle of wine, or discover something new. To place an order for pickup or delivery, download the Liquor Barn app, visit liquorbarn.com, or call your nearest Liquor Barn location. Follow us on social media and subscribe to our email list for all the latest news on products, promotions, and events. Liquor Barn, where Kentuckians go to celebrate life. Cheers!
There's a new award-winning 4-grain straight bourbon whiskey that's been taking the market by storm, Penelope Bourbon. Bottled in historic Bardstown, Kentucky, Penelope's balanced yet flavorful taste profile comes from a unique blend of 3 bourbon mash bills. Currently available in multiple expressions, Penelope is remarkably smooth and flavorful. So whether you're sipping neat or using it in your favorite cocktail, Penelope is the perfect choice for you. Penelope's full lineup is available in select markets as well as online. Visit PenelopeBourbon.com to learn more and to find a store near you.
Welcome to the Bourbon Life Podcast, your source for all things bourbon. Join your hosts, Mark and Matt, as they drink and review bourbons, share news about upcoming events, interview the who's who in the bourbon world, and, most importantly, bring you along for the fun of living the bourbon life. Now, here's your hosts, Mark and Matt.
All right, everybody, welcome back for another episode of the Bourbon Life Podcast. I'm your host, Mark, and with me tonight live here in the Bourbon Life studios, it's my good friend, Matt. Matt, how you doing out there, buddy?
Mark, I'm doing great out here. Got the fireplace roaring a little bit, kind of a chillier day, but nice and sunny springtime day here in central Kentucky. How are you doing, though?
You know what, Matt? I'm doing great. I'm really looking forward to this show. We've talked about doing this for quite a while, so I'm really happy that
I've been bugging you about this one for
you have been
since season 1, I think.
It's been on the radar, and it's just something that I had not managed to put together. So I'm really excited for you and for me, but I'm more excited for you because I know you've wanted to do this show, man. So I'm excited. I'm excited that we're here. We are, of course, the Bourbon Life Podcast presented by VisitLEX. We appreciate their support. We appreciate the support of all of our sponsors and everything they do for us. They make it possible for us to come to you guys every week with these great stories and these great people in the industry. So, Matt, with that said, you want to tell everybody who we have with us tonight?
I would love to. We are headed out to Brooklyn, New York this evening, this morning, this afternoon to chat with our guest, and he is the co-founder and distiller at Kings County Distillery there in Brooklyn, Colin Spoelman. Colin, welcome to the Bourbon Life Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Matt.
We are so glad you're here.
Hey, did we get your last name? Please tell me we got your last name right.
Yes.
I was,
okay.
I meant to ask you beforehand just to double check because I always like to make sure that. But everything I've listened to, that's the way I've heard your name pronounced, and I just went with that. But usually double check it.
No, that's
all right. Well, Matt, I didn't make you look bad tonight, man.
No, absolutely not. If I look bad, it's on my own conscience here, or my own doing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, Colin, we appreciate you. You kind of had to rearrange your schedule to work around my schedule, and I appreciate you doing that so you could be with us tonight. Before we jump into the conversation, though, we've got something poured up for this first round. Would you care to share with everybody what we're going to be drinking on our first round here?
Sure. So first up is the Kings County Blended Bourbon. And blended, we sort of think of blended whiskeys as this sort of down shelf, sort of foreign thing. But if you think about when people worldwide drink whiskey, more often than not, they're having a blended Scotch whiskey or they're having a blended Canadian whiskey. So as much as we are, as Americans, obsessed with bourbon, there is a big, broad world of blended whiskeys out there. Blended bourbon is a little bit of a fun category where it has to be 51% bourbon. The rest can be whatever you want. In our case, this is all Kings County made whiskeys. So it's all made by us. There's no neutral spirit, but there's
Okay.
some rye in there, some single malt,
Okay, well that's what I was going to ask, because I think a lot of times, at least in the American context, when you say blended bourbon, I think people just associate and think neutral grain spirits. That's what we're talking about. The majority, or not the majority, but a big part of it being that. So that was probably the first question with regard to this expression, was what we're doing. So this is all distilled whiskey that you all have actually distilled there in Brooklyn. Yeah,
and it's all whiskeys that are 2 years old. So
okay,
for us, this is just how do we? The brief was make a decent whiskey that's 2 years old. We played around with a corn whiskey for a long time, didn't quite come together, and so it needed some older whiskeys in it, and this was the sort of vehicle that we ended up going with. So this is really just a way to make a less expensive. A lot of our whiskeys are very expensive, so it's a way to make a more entry level, more accessible whiskey, but doing it from our own stocks and from the sort of entry level basis, basically well aged, 2 year sort of standard.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Matt, you've been over there nosing it a little bit already, and you know how I always do. I throw it to you to get some nosing notes.
Absolutely.
So what do you pick up on it, man?
So I think a lot of times when people hear blended bourbon, they also think of like batched bourbon. I know sometimes I can get those two confused. And I love the category of blended bourbon that you've come here with, and that is becoming a little bit more popular nowadays. It takes me, growing up in Michigan, Canadian whiskeys were always popular. And it's a style I really like and I really enjoy. And this is definitely no exception. The nose on it got a nice brightness of corn, good sweetness, honey, some kind of lingering vanillas, a little bit of like herbal notes, kind of like earthy tea kind of note, like tea leaves, maybe like a little mint or eucalyptus as well. Just a really, really nice nose. This is I've had this before. This is one of my favorite products. I absolutely just love the category of blended bourbon, and I like seeing it coming back to life.
Yeah. So Colin, going back to that and the decision to make this. So this was something that you felt like, number one, maybe it was going to be a challenge to kind of bring in this category and maybe not well, I mean, a lot of people, this is an introduction to the blended category. I mean, was that kind of the thought process behind what you were doing with it?
Yeah, and I would say, even expanding that comment more broadly, I think Kings County as a distillery likes to take things that people think they don't want or like. like moonshine, we started with unaged whiskey, and if you ask somebody, what's the best whiskey in the world, people say, the oldest whiskey in the world. I can do math, I can count on my fingers, I can be a connoisseur of whiskey, but when it comes to unaged whiskey, zero age whiskey, take age out of the equation, some whiskeys are going to be better than others. And so we started with moonshine as a sort of novelty, but not as a joke, but something very serious, like let's make the best unaged whiskey we can make. Then we did a bottled in bond, which at the time was really perceived as this kind of bottom shelf. Bartenders were kind of into it because it was high proof, but bottled in bond didn't have the audience that it does now. And so I think with this product, again, we're kind of going into the dusty books of how you make whiskey or how you categorize whiskey, or and finding something that maybe people have overlooked and say, actually, this has a very useful purpose. Let's take it out of the binder and see what we can do with it. There's not that many blended bourbons that are out there. They're usually sourced products, blenders, independent bottlers, whatever you want to call them, who are taking from multiple distilleries. This is perhaps a rare example of a blended bourbon taken from one products made at one distillery.
Right. Yeah. Very, very unique, very different type of blended bourbon than what people might be used to. Now, you mentioned moonshine. So that is a perfect segue, I believe, to go back and talk a little bit about who you are.
Sure.
Because you've got a very interesting story and background. So would you share with our listeners a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and then what you've done in the past, and then how that got you and brought you into the world of whiskey?
Right. So I grew up in Eastern Kentucky, Harlan County, and it's a dry county, so there's not not a lot of official drinking going on, but there's a lot of unofficial drinking going on.
Yeah.
And when I was growing up, when I was coming of age in the sort of awareness around alcohol, but not necessarily of a legal age to consume it, we would go to the bootlegger, who was somebody who would just go to Richmond, Kentucky, or
Right.
Virginia, where it was legal to buy alcohol, and then they would come back and mark it up. So, but there were some of these places, some of the bootleggers, that were selling actual moonshine, where somebody had a still set up in a garage or up in the woods or something, and so it was really after moving to New York City and then traveling back to Kentucky, I would bring a plastic jug of moonshine, because that's how it came. That was the packaging, and shared it with New Yorkers. And New York is in a way the sort of opposite of Kentucky, or opposite of Eastern Kentucky anyway, where you have if there was hardly any sort of above board drinking going on. In New York, there's a bar in every corner. There's a restaurant with a liquor license. Everybody's apartments are too small to hang out in, so people go out. It's a very adventurous, city. And so for people to discover this Appalachian moonshine was something that that was genuinely sort of curious to people who had kind of traveled around a very sophisticated, very worldly New York City restaurant cuisine, and were totally taken with it. And so rather than continuing to import this illegal moonshine, I thought, well, how hard can it be? And so got a still off the internet and started distilling in my apartment, which is not a legal thing to do, but I think is a wonderful act of protest against the federal government's restrictions. And I can say no further than that, under penalty of
yeah, that's right,
of prosecution. But but it was a way, as a sense, to kind of learn distilling, and obviously distilling is a very important business to Kentucky, whether you're doing it legally or not. So it kind of got me a little bit hooked on the sort of the brewing aspect of making whiskey. And I mean everything from mashing, fermenting, distilling. And so that kind of, through that process of kind of experimentation and being a hobbyist, very quickly realized that, this mythology around having a master distiller from 7 generations, you could make perfectly palatable stuff. And in fact, sometimes more palatable stuff at a small scale in your kitchen than this sort of vaunted legacy of products that were coming from the sort of heritage distilleries in Kentucky.
So I'm just curious, Colin, when you were growing up, because did I read somewhere your dad is a minister? Is that right?
Yeah. He was a Presbyterian minister and had 3 little churches.
Okay.
I mean, way out in the middle of deep in the hills of Kentucky.
Oh,
And
well,
so,
okay. I was just going to say, I got to tell you, because Matt hates it when I say that. Well, he doesn't hate it, but I used to say it all the time. But I'm from Eastern Kentucky. So I'm from Greenup County up in northeastern Kentucky,
Okay, yeah,
the Ashland area, and my parents were born and raised down in Pike County. So I spent a lot of time down there in the summer. So we call that Bourbon Life bingo, so people can fill in their squares at home, because I just got to say that I'm from Eastern Kentucky, Colin. So
right.
happy to get to share that. But I mean, and I understand. I mean, growing up there, because my parents were Southern Baptist, went to church, teetotalers, drinking wasn't allowed. Of course, I was drinking beer by the time I was 15 years old.
Right.
Moonshine wasn't as prevalent there in the Ashland, area because we weren't as rural. But was that something, I mean, as a kid growing up, was that something you were around or exposed to, or did you see it, or did you know it existed?
No, I had a very similar experience. I mean, moonshine was not really something that I was much aware of, because think about it, when you're in high school, you're just, you're just trying to get something safe.
Right.
You're not trying to like blow your mind when you're 14. You just want to sort of dip a toe into the world of alcohol. And so, it was really not until after leaving Kentucky, going to college, moving to New York, that's when I kind of came back and was thinking, we did grow up with all these bootleggers. Surely some of them, had moonshine, and many of them did. And it was just, that was there for the old timers, but not necessarily for the, my demographic.
Yeah.
So,
very cool.
Yeah. So it was really, partly a function of my own, kind of, I had to go away to come back to be interested in moonshine,
Sure. And that makes perfect sense. So here's a big question. How did you end up going from Harlan, Kentucky, ending up in Brooklyn, New York?
Right. Well, it's a very circuitous path, but because my father was a minister, there's a boarding school in Tennessee, and my mom was very keen. I mean, good schools in Eastern Kentucky. I mean, not always perceived to be good schools, but there are good school districts, and Harlan Independent is a good school district. But my mother was just, she was kind of like, you have an opportunity, you should take it. And there was this boarding school that had a scholarship for the children of Presbyterian ministers. So I went to boarding school for 2 years, and it was a college prep school. And then that helped me get into Yale.
Wow.
And so I went to college in Connecticut for 4 years, and then had no idea what I was going to do, and turned almost immediately to moonshine. But there was a little bit of an interim period with architecture. So that's kind of what I studied in school, and what I would have done were it not for moonshining. And another factor, which was that New York State had just changed its laws to allow for smaller distilleries, and they lowered the price of a distiller's license from $13,000 a year to $128 a year.
Oh, wow.
Which was very significant and very business forward. And so I found myself in a position of being sort of fascinated with distilling, being fascinated with this culture that I had come from, both the moonshine part of Kentucky and the bourbon part of Kentucky, which are both, New York doesn't know the difference, but they're both interesting, right? So, and simultaneously, I was in this city that was very interested in distilled spirits and cocktail culture, and the state had just changed its laws around distillers' licenses. So it was a very fortuitous sort of convergence of my own background, the licensing around distilleries, the appetite in the consumer base to try new things, as opposed to the sort of safety of commercial products that have been around forever. And so it just led to this, my business partner and I, David Haskell, kind of taking a leap, forming a limited liability company and saying, let's raise not very much money, a few $1,000s to hire the lawyer and to get a commercial distilling space. And so in 2010, we got our license and became the first distillery in New York City since Prohibition.
Wow.
And one that from the beginning has been very focused on whiskeys, which I think in the craft community is a little unusual. There's not that many distilleries that don't go to gin and go to vodka and go to rum before they get to whiskey. We were always whiskey, and the moonshine helped that in a certain way, because you could do, instead of making gin, we did flavored, whiskeys, white whiskeys.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and you see that, like in Eastern Tennessee, especially where they have all the different little moonshine distilleries. That's a big thing, is the flavored moonshines. They sell like crazy. People line up to buy those bottles. I may have a few here or there. I may have a few of the illegal ones as well.
Right. Well, right. I mean, it was knowing that people didn't drink moonshine straight, but they put in grape juice, or they put in, whatever,
Yeah, no doubt.
whatever
No
they
doubt.
could find to make it palatable. And so for us in a commercial distillery, why wouldn't we do the same thing?
Yeah.
And
But I
so,
mean, it sounds like it was
yeah.
very serendipitous almost. And like all these factors came together that really created this, I mean, perfect opportunity for you guys. And you really seized it, which is really cool. So Matt, let's jump back and talk about the blended bourbon whiskey. What do you pick up in terms of the palate and the finish on this one?
On the palate, I get really nice front palate, good sweet corn coming across, good sweetness. Also get like a sweet mint, like a sweet tea, almost like sweet mint tea. Then to me, it's starting to go a little bit more the fruity side. I get kind of like a tartness, almost like a grapefruit on the palate, and like a little citrus, apricot, stone fruit finish. A little bit of peppercorn comes in there too. I think maybe some influence from the rye is seen that way, but it's just got that nice, big, oily, kind of bold, funky, pot stilled taste to it that is just really great. Really, really great.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, with the pot stills, and we can talk about that process a little bit later, but you do get that nice oily mouthfeel from that. You're maintaining a lot of those different congeners and oils and fats in there that you're going to lose when you strip it out in a column still. So I think that's really reflective in what we're drinking here. But yeah, Matt, I agree. You get that corn up front. I get that sweetness, but the corn also, it's almost like that frosted. We've talked about frosted flakes before, where you get that corn sweetness. But you get that sugary effect as well. So that's really one of the initial things. But yeah, I agree that rye does come through as well. There's a bit of spiciness. There's a bit of heat. I get almost like a after effect, like almost like clove, some type of effect of that as well. But then there's also, you said you mixed in some single malt with this as well. Is that right, Colin? Okay. So
Yeah,
there's some of that.
there's a little bit. I'll say, I can give you
Okay.
the breakdown is, it's 53% 2-year straight bourbon, 26% corn whiskey in used barrels, 12.5% older bourbon, 3 to 4 year bourbon in small format barrels. Then there's 4% rye and a little bit less than 4% of single malt.
Okay. Not a whole lot, but I still kind of get that. There's almost like that Scotch malty kind of taste as well that comes through.
And there is a lot of malt in the mash bill for the bourbon.
Okay.
So,
that's right. Yeah.
Even though you're not getting that much single malt, in totality, you have a lot of malted barley going into this particular blend from different sources.
Okay. Well, that makes sense, because I was picking that aroma, that flavor up as well on the palate. So that makes sense. So we're almost at the end of round one here, but I wanted to ask you a question before we close it out, since we're still talking about you. You're also an author. That's really cool. Can you take a few moments and kind of talk about the books that you've written? Because you've written 2, right?
Yeah. So the first book was really as this experience of kind of building a distillery from a moonshine like hobby still. There was a lot of curiosity around that, and people, I think, for the first time were a little bit, the federal government does not prosecute moonshiners anymore. There are state governments that will prosecute moonshiners, but generally when there's an egregiously dangerous or, there's a lot of tax revenue being siphoned away. But the hobby moonshiner is not necessarily somebody that you typically see governments going after, but But anyway, this was the first book. This one's called The Guide to Urban Moonshining. And it really is a little bit of a step-by-step, not with the intent of like, if you want a guide to really go home and distill your own whiskey, there are probably other books that you would want to pick up in addition to this one. But this is really just how to understand whiskey from the perspective of, if you were going to set out to make it, you would, you need a certain amount of corn, you need to strain the mash. This is how you pitch the yeast, what kind of yeast, how long do you let it sit for? When you run a still, how do you make cuts? How do you separate things like the heads, the hearts, and the tails? What do those flavors taste? What are those notes on the nose? What are those notes on the palate? All of that stuff kind of went into this book. But it was also came out in 2013, and it was at a time of great curiosity around bourbon generally. And as people were starting to realize that there were a lot of brands on the shelves, but they were all coming from a handful of corporate owners and some legacy distilleries in Kentucky, and what was to differentiate the sort of sourced whiskeys from the heritage distillers, from the new craft distillers that were popping up. So this book kind of went into that sort of landscape of not just how do you make whiskey, but how are some of the commercial brands made, where are they made, who owns this, what's high rye bourbon, kind of. People had a lot of questions about bourbon, and rather than giving it to you in a sort of encyclopedic way, this was really more, how would you approach it if you were to be the distiller, and I think that was fun for people. That book did reasonably well for a whiskey book, and then I wrote a book called Dead Distillers. Nobody has purchased this book. But
hey, Colin, I'm going to tell you, I just bought it today on Amazon, man.
Okay,
so,
good.
Yeah, because I'm fascinated with history, and I'm fascinated. Right. The more I read about all these old distillers and distilleries, the more I want to learn about it. So I did buy your book today. So there you go. One sell.
I am sure you will enjoy it. Anybody who's deep into bourbon history, bourbon generally enough to have a podcast, will appreciate just how much we go into some of these characters. But I, as a distiller, came to sort of realize that distillers were these very charismatic, just totally fascinating characters out of the history book, and characters that you didn't learn in school because it was alcohol.
Right.
And so much of American history was just kind of like this little missing part of a thread that you could have learned in school, but you didn't. And so getting to learn about folks like I.W. Bernheim and Jack Daniel and Jim Beam, of course, but then there's also George Washington was a distiller, and Henry Clay Frick was a distiller who was mostly known as an industrialist, and robber baron in Pennsylvania in the turn of the 1900s. So, just great, cool, fun stories about whiskey, tied together only through whiskey distillers.
Well, I'll make sure I give a review.
Yeah. You can tell people what you think.
That's right. Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting that in, because I saw that when I was doing some research for the show, and I was like, man, I'm in all the way. Yeah, so that's going to be cool. I'm looking forward to that. Well, Colin, I tell you what, let's take a quick break. We can get a word from our sponsors, and then we'll come back and we'll talk more about the distillery itself and how you guys started everything. So everybody just sit back, relax, and we'll be back in just a minute with more with Colin Spoelman from Kings County Distillery in just a minute.
The Stave Restaurant is a bourbon lover's paradise right here in the heart of bourbon country. Located at 5711 McCracken Pike in Millville, Kentucky, between Castle and Key and Woodford Reserve, Chef Kyle Klatka prepares amazing food each day that features an elevated Kentucky-inspired cuisine. With a full-service bar, great bourbon flights, and signature cocktails, the Stave is the perfect place to catch up with friends after a fun-filled day of touring the local distilleries. Be sure to check them out online at thestavekentucky.com or at Instagram and Facebook at The Stave Kentucky. Three Chord's line of whiskeys embody the spirit of creativity. The whiskey is a true collaboration between producer and composer Neil Giraldo and master blender distiller Ari Sussman. The Three Chord team of expert blenders, coopers, and sensory professionals have developed a multi-step process they call Perfectly Tuned Taste. This process begins by carefully selecting the finest bourbon and rye whiskeys from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana, and then blending them together. Find out more about the whiskeys and distribution in your area at www.threechordbourbon.com.
All right, everybody, welcome back for round 2 of the Bourbon Life Podcast. I'm your host, Mark, and with me here, still live in the Bourbon Life Studios, it's my good friend, Matt. Matt, how you doing, bud?
Mark, I am still with you and still live here in the Bourbon Life Studios and doing great. We're having a good time in your basement, also known as the Bourbon Life Studios.
That's right.
So
that's right.
How are you doing?
Kind of weird when you say we're having a good time in my basement. I don't know. There's something kind of creepy about that, Matt. But that bottle, just disregard that bottle of lotion over there. No, I'm just kidding. But hey, man, wow. I'm happy you're here. Yeah, I'm happy you're here. We're having a great time. And this is a show you're like giddy as could be, man, because you've wanted to do this show forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm excited. This is a show I would listen to, and I actually get to be a part of it. And I
Yeah,
don't listen to our
yeah.
podcast, so that's
Matt
pretty
doesn't
cool.
listen to our podcast, Colin. Just so
okay.
you know.
No.
Yeah, this is like episode 169 now, and I don't think Matt's listened to a single one since it's come out. But this one he may go back and actually listen to. So I've never seen Matt fanboy, but we're saying Matt's fanboying on the Kings County Distillery tonight, man. So
Absolutely.
with that said, though, Matt, I kind of told everybody now who we've had with us, but tell everybody who we have with us tonight.
Thanks. Now that the cat's out of the bag, we have the co-founder and distiller at Kings County in Brooklyn, New York, Colin Spoelman. Colin, welcome back for round number 2.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, we appreciate you hanging around too. It wouldn't have been a very fun show, if it's just me and Matt sitting around drinking your whiskey. I mean, we'd do it, but
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, don't force us. We'll do it.
Oh man! So this round we got something different poured up. So Colin, you want to tell everybody what we're going to be drinking in this round 2?
Yeah, so this is the Kings County Straight Bourbon, and when we set out to make bourbon, the idea was not to replicate what was happening in Kentucky. And in some senses, I was like naive enough that I didn't even know how to make a Kentucky bourbon. So it's a high malt, high corn bourbon. So it's 20% English malted barley, and it's 80% New York State organic corn. It's pot distilled, which preserves a lot of the sort of oils and flavors and sort of texture, or gives you sort of a little bit thicker texture to the whiskey itself. And then it's aged in a variety of different barrel formats, anywhere from 3 to up to 6 years. So but because we are using different barrel formats, we tend to have some smaller barrels thrown in there that give it a little bit more flavor than you would otherwise get from a 3 to 6 year age statement.
Okay.
So it is a very full flavored sort of Christmas holiday spice bourbon, but in the scheme of things is, sort of entry level age statement.
Gotcha. And this one is 90 proof. I forgot to say that. And the last one was 86, right? The blended, I think, is 86. I think I forgot to mention that during the segment 1 here. So Matt, throwing it over to you, man. What do you pick up on the nose on this one?
So this the 80-20 corn to barley has the perfect ground beef recipe as well. You got to do 80-20 80-20 ground beef.
Right.
Yeah.
There you go, man.
So I appreciate that right from the start. It's got a nice, like the first thing I noticed is it's got kind of a smoky aroma, kind of like campfirey, oaky, smoked aroma on it. And then when you were saying kind of those Christmas spices, those definitely come through. Some of the cinnamon, nutmeg, little ginger on it as well. Just a really nice kind of complete full nose. Sweetness from corn in there too. Little, of course, the vanillas, the caramels. Just really nice. A completely different nose from what we had in the first round from the blended bourbon, which I think is a fun experiment to go through and tasting, of course, 2 different products, but kind of similar and different at the same time.
Matt, you stole my thunder. You took vanilla and caramel. So
sorry, man.
You left me with nothing now, man. I'm
Right.
I'm spent. I'm out. That's it. I tapped out. Nothing. No tasting notes. No nosing notes. In addition to me, no, but I do get that sweet corn, and that's cool. So this is an 80-20. There is no rye. There is no wheat.
Right.
So I'm curious. So was that part of that decision of just doing something that is like just different from Kentucky? Was that the decision, or really what was it that made you go with that mash bill?
I mean, the true story is that I had I had a book from the library, a book from the, I think it was from the 80s, on how to be a home distiller, and it's written by this Canadian guy, and his suggestion when you start distilling is don't fool with rye, because as many distillers will tell you, rye is a gelatinous grain and it's hard to work with.
Yeah.
So it was a little bit like make your life easy. Use malted barley, which brewers love and is worldwide a very common ingredient in whiskeys. And so, there was a time when we did start to play with rye and wheat, and we have made wheated bourbon, we have made rye bourbon, but this high malt barley, high barley content, high malt content bourbon, ultimately it just sort of ended up making sense with the marketing that we wanted to tell, which is that we're located more in a more international environment than Kentucky, and maybe our whiskeys look a little bit more to Scotch whiskey, an old world tradition, than a Kentucky bourbon would, but I don't know how much of that really comes through. I mean, when you try it, it definitely just tastes like a lovely, rich bourbon. I mean, you would maybe situate it as a craft bourbon because it's got more of that sort of viscosity that we talked about. But
Yeah.
I really wanted to, I looked at the world of commercial bourbon, which was all made at Colin distilleries, Colin still distilleries, and really thought that, there was an opportunity for a pot still bourbon. And I still think there's huge opportunity for pot still bourbon. There's
Yeah.
Woodford Reserve, which has pot stills, and is a beautiful distillery, and is a really fun visit and a great story. But not necessarily when you buy a bottle of Woodford does every single drop of it come off of those
Yeah.
3 stills, and then they got some more stills. So to just keep the story going. But in terms of, is there a distillery, is there a commercial brand where everything comes off a pot still? There's not that much of that out there. And when the world of Scotch whiskey believes so deeply in pot stills, and me as a hobby distiller, I believe very deeply that pot stills don't necessarily give you better whiskey, but they give the distiller more latitude over the flavor of the whiskey.
Okay.
So it's less about a qualitative thing and more about if you're a distiller and you want to really make narrow cuts and make a really perfect whiskey off a pot still, you can do that. If you make a really cheap whiskey off a pot still, you can make a triple distilled whiskey off a pot still. You just have a lot more flexibility over what the whiskey is going to taste like, and make those decisions on a daily basis with every batch, as opposed to a column still, which is really kind of tuned and
Right.
set up to run in towards a particular flavor, and be continuously fed, and isn't really batched in the same way.
Yeah, and that's just for our listeners out there that maybe don't understand. I mean, the column stills they're running continuous, like you said. I mean, there's a continual feed of beer coming through there, and it's stripping out the alcohol, and it could strip it up to super high proofs. But the column stills is a batch process. I mean, what you're running, the pot still is a batch process.
Mm-hmm.
So you run it, and then you got to clean everything out, right? So it's more labor intensive. Is that really a way to?
For sure, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But like you said, you've got those opportunities. So in terms of controlling and changing, again, I'm kind of curious to go down that rabbit hole just a little bit. The tweaks that you can do as a distiller, the control you have. I mean, you're controlling reflux, the interaction of the spirit with the copper and the cuts and the heat and everything. Can you kind of talk about those different variables that as a distiller you can really play with more with that pot still?
Right. So, I mean, you don't necessarily have that many variables that you can play with, but you do have really the rate at which you open up the steam valve, so the temperature of which you're running the still.
Yeah.
So the speed at which you're running the still. You have the head cut and the heart, the tail cut, really, when you begin to collect the whiskey and when you stop collecting the whiskey, have a pretty big impact on the flavor. So with a pot still, you usually divide into the heads, which are solventy, sort of nail polish remover. There's a lot of methanol, acetone, acetaldehyde. And then there's the tails, which are the sort of higher boiling point chemicals that can give it sort of a soapy, funky, skunky beer sort of flavor, just sort of undesirable in a different direction. And so with the pot still, you can say, let's make a really biting, intense whiskey. That's more from the head side. Or you can say, let's make a more floral, funky whiskey, taking more from the backside. Or you could just make a big, broad whiskey from both cuts. I mean, push cuts on both ends. Or you could take a pretty narrow cut right down the middle, and then you'd really just take the best part of the run and recycle all the rest into future batches, or just, discard it, move on, and restart.
Yeah.
So the sense with a pot still, it's not just the cuts, but it's the recycling back from the day before. It's how narrow are your cuts. It's at what cut point are you, how solventy do you want to go? How funky do you want to go to put it sort of in
Yeah.
very basic terms.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, go ahead, Matt.
And are you trying to keep your cuts fairly consistent, or some days are you kind of like, well, let's push it a little bit, or like, where do you?
Let's be funky.
Yeah,
Right. In general, everything is designed to be more or less the same every day,
yeah,
day in and day out. But there are some like process drift situations where we'll just sort of, as time goes on, people will kind of gravitate towards a higher cut or whatever it is, and then there may be a reset. And I'm not certainly running the still anymore. This is now we have Brandon Collins, who's our
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah. We just brought him in from Taconic.
Yeah,
that's right.
He's our master distillery manager. Worked at Buffalo Trace for a long time, and it really was a great opportunity for me, who has always sort of held the role of being the lead distiller. But I've just narrated my entire experience, my knowledge and experience of whiskey. I don't have a proper sort of chemical engineering background. But Brandon does, and has experience both in a Kentucky column distill environment, in a craft column still environment, and now at Kings County running the pot stills. And so it's been really fun to kind of take the process that we have and say, you sort of have a perspective on distilling. What do you think about this? And are there tweaks that you want to do? And so on and so forth. So I think that's going to even make things more regular and consistent than they have been, which has been a little seasonal, goes in the direction of different personality types. But what I will say on the flip side of all that is, to some extent, you're either a distillery that's looking to make exactly the same thing every day, or you want a little variety, because in the end, you're going to be assembling different, tranches or sets of barrels into blends. And that's certainly what we do. I'll say there's kind of two approaches to making whiskey. One is, okay, we have a 4-year age statement. So every time the barrel crosses the 4-year mark, we dump it into a tank, it's ready to go. And we try to get as many barrels as possible, so it's the most consistent flavor. Or you say, we have a flavor profile in mind, and every time we go to blend, we're going to take some 4 years, some 6 years, some 3-year, and try and get that flavor profile every time from by sense memory. And that's obviously much more challenging, but as a small distillery, actually yields more interesting results, because you can sort of push it and find those like black tea or clove, or those notes really become singular that you try to highlight in a particular blend.
Yeah, that's really cool. Brandon's a great guy. We had him on the show before. When he's with Taconic. So we're happy to hear that. I'd forgotten. I'd seen his post on Instagram about joining you guys. So congratulated him. So that's really cool. So Colin, let's go back, because you talked a little bit in the first round about how you started the distillery. Can we go back and dive into that just a little bit more? So you're in your apartment, you're illegally distilling. Wait, as an attorney, I'm just going to say, Colin had no involvement in that process. There was some activity somewhere that he was not aware of and did not approve of. So with that said, Colin.
Yeah. I think I can own up to it after the statute of limitations
there you go.
fully passed, which I have not illegally distilled for some 13 years.
There you go.
And I feel confident that it is squarely in my criminal past, and I can move on. But yeah, so there was this opportunity to kind of, New York State had just changed its laws, and it was a good time to maybe put in for a license, and began with that moonshine, with really just sort of hoping that a New York audience would be curious about this very Appalachian, very Southern, very, country or rural type of spirit in my perception. And in fact, there was a lot of interest, because if you have a sort of farm to table movement and people are going to the farmer's market and they want to learn about their food and they want to be connected to their food, moonshine was really a more authentic, direct route to the spirits maker than something like Kentucky bourbon, which is filtered through age and corporate distillers and marketing and a lot of layers that sort of protect you don't know what, because it's not the most transparent thing. So to be able to come to an audience with transparency at a time when that's really what they were after from their producers was really, a great opportunity that allowed us to sell a lot of white whiskey when a lot of people would also, on the flip side, be turning up their noses at the idea of a white whiskey. And yeah.
So then, so you were in this small area, your apartment, distilling, and then so how do you guys? Because you guys are in a really cool location now. Can you talk about that transition from distilling in a very small place and then moving into this whole building in a very unique space?
So once we got our license, once that was approved by the liquor authority, we ended up we had a little lease on a 1-room studio, kind of, 300 square feet. And we took that hobby still, that 8-gallon still, and moved it into that space, and we bought 4 more. So we had 5 8-gallon stills that collectively were making about 1.5 gallons of moonshine every day. But 1.5 gallons of moonshine was really like, cases. And then we ran a night shift. So we were really making 3 gallons a day. And that was, that's like 2 cases of moonshine at 40% alcohol in 200 milliliter bottles. So we were selling a lot of these kind of, little pocket flasks. And at $20 a pop, that was enough to sort of keep the business going and to pay for buying some barrels and laying down some real aged whiskey, which as a home distiller, really, you get excited about the moonshine, but then at a certain point you're sort of like, well, this would be cool if we could age it, and this would be cool if we could age it 2 years and 4 years and 7 years, and so that's when I looked to raise more money, get bigger stills, and move to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is where we are now. So the whole distillery moved to the Brooklyn Navy Yard in 2012, and we've been gradually growing within that space, and now we actually have 6 buildings. 4 buildings in Brooklyn, and then 2 buildings out in Long Island where we just do barrel storage.
Okay. Wow.
So they're all small buildings.
But still,
big. But
from a 300 square foot studio to 6 buildings, that's pretty significant. But now you guys, you just celebrated like your lucky 13? Is that right?
13-year anniversary earlier this month. We haven't had a big party yet because it's the weather. We're waiting for consistently good weather. So
yes, are we?
No doubt.
Right. So probably in May we'll have a big party to celebrate 13 years. But in the world of whiskey, in a Silicon Valley sort of situation, 13 years is a very long time. In the world of whiskey, it is a very short time. And if you're serious about it, it becomes a very, this is a life's work, and it will take my entire adult working life to get to a 25-year bourbon, so. Right. So that is a big project and one that takes a lot of time. And so 13 years is hardly the beginning of it. It does really feel that way. And it also feels like there's a perception in American whiskey where people are really finally genuinely curious about craft whiskey and not so quick to dismiss it as young or, I don't know, pot stills are bad or small barrels are bad or this, that, and the next thing, really just sort of, there is a little bit of an open mind, and also like commercial whiskey has been strained very deeply by the bourbon boom. There's only so much whiskey that those legacy heritage producers can make, and so in certain instances quality has gone down, and then it's rebounded because then they find their age statement again, and they they've laid plans, and then it's like, oh yeah, we got our age statement back because we realized 4 years ago that we needed to make a lot more of this stuff.
Yeah. But you were talking about 13 years not being, yes, when you look at a Jim Beam, you look at it, even a Heaven Hill. Yeah. Okay. 13 years in comparison to that. But in terms of the craft distillery movement, to say that you were there in 2010, that makes you guys really one of the first that I can think of. I'm thinking like people like Paul Let Go, with Few. He was around that same time. Guys like that, when you think craft distilleries that have been around, those that come to mind, you think around that 2010-ish area. So, you guys were right there in the mix of that.
Yeah, there were a lot of us that came in like right around then, and I don't know what it was around that time. I mean, there were some articles in various different publications that were sort of hinting that you could build a distillery. I mean, I think it's one of those things that most people assumed cost a fortune and was very inaccessible, even as a small business.
Yeah.
But the other thing that was happening is around that time, the internet was really making it tenable to run a small business with a small audience.
Yeah.
And you didn't necessarily need distribution in the traditional sense if you had an online audience. And social media then, which came around in 2011 in the form of like Facebook was, I don't know, 2008. And
right.
I mean, it was before then, but in terms of when it became sort of widely adopted, Instagram was soon after that. And those two platforms, coupled with just the gradual acceptance of the internet, and email marketing and a lot of stuff that we take for granted now, was still in its infancy. You know, like the MailChimp, as we know it now, did not exist in 2010. So, so I think that was a big piece of why those businesses came around at that particular time, because you needed the connection to the audience, and the internet made that sort of, gave you the tools to make that happen in a way that it didn't exist just 5 years prior, with like MySpace being sort of a mess. And,
yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. That's a great explanation. I had not thought about that, but yeah, that makes perfect sense. Matt, we're close to the end of round 2 here. Let's jump back to the whiskey. This is the straight bourbon whiskey, 90 proof. What do you pick up on this in terms of the palate and the finish?
I get a nice palate of like corn pudding, like a sweet corn pudding. Those baking spices are definitely evident on the palate. There's that cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, all those, that great ginger, allspice, kind of the Christmas baking spices. And then I'm getting like a good bit of the barley coming through with this. There's some cocoa on the palate that I pick up, some cereal grain as well, that kind of comes through for me. And then the finish has like a sweetness, kind of, I've used this before, but like a bit of honey candy, kind of like that caramely honey, like kind of like the same experience with one of those where you kind of eat one and it just is like kind of oily and buttery stuck all over like your mouth. It has like a really rich, oily, kind of buttery taste to it as well, feeling.
Yeah, Matt, that sweetness comes through, not like as much in terms of that, the first one, the blended bourbon, but there is a lot of sweetness to this one as well. But there's still that spice. This spice comes through much more prevalent to me, and it almost to the point that it's almost to me like a gradual heat, almost like a rye, like you've got rye whiskey in there, which is kind of funny. But my tongue just, Matt, you're shaking your head, you know?
Yeah, I think you're right, Mark. Had I not known the mash bill, I would have guessed this to have a little bit, maybe not a high rye, but to have some presence.
Right, but 10, 12% rye maybe, because you get that little bit of heat that kind of gradually progresses, which is kind of, to me, reminiscent of a lower rye mash bill. So that's kind of what I thought. But yes, Matt, those baking spices, those Christmas spices, again, you talked about, Colin, definitely come through. The finish is very nice. And again, 90 proof, very easy to sip. The malt comes through as well. I picked that up. It reminds me somewhat of, I'm not a big Scotch drinker, but the Scotches that I have that are unpeated, it kind of just that same malt flavor that comes through, or single malt American whiskeys that I've had. It kind of has reminiscent of that aroma and flavor as well. So very nice. Did we miss anything, Colin?
I think that's comprehensive. I mean, it's certainly, you know, I don't, I find it some sort of hard to give my own tasting notes, because I just feel like everybody's so subjective, and there's very few ways to talk about a whiskey that are truly universal to everybody's palate. So, but those generally, you know, I do think in the world of bourbon, a caramel, vanilla, a lot of Christmas spice, that tends to be where this bourbon sits relative to our other whiskeys. You know, hard to say where it sits next to commercial bourbon because it is so different, but
Right.
but not drastically. I mean, it's still bourbon. You would not confuse this for a single malt. You wouldn't confuse it for like a Canadian whiskey or a certainly not an Irish whiskey. So,
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree with that. All right, guys. I'll tell you what, we're at the end of round 2. Woo. Let's take a quick break. Let's get a word from our sponsors. We'll be back with more with Colin Spoelman from Kings County Distillery in just a minute. From our good friends at the Stave comes Lexington's newest hot spot to meet up with friends, have fun, and eat some great food. District 7 Social is a social and beer hall, but it's a lot more than that. Located in Lexington's Distillery District, it's the home of Lexington's first duck pin bowling lanes, and it also features a self-serve beer wall. That's right, self-serve. And if you want more, they've got it. You can try one of their delicious cocktails from the bar or order some great German fusion food from their on-site eatery, Germanish. So what are you waiting for? Be seen, be social. District 7 Social. All right, everybody, welcome back for the third and final round of the Bourbon Life Podcast. I'm your host, Mark, and with me tonight, here live in the Bourbon Life Studios, otherwise, as Matt calls it, my basement, it is my good friend, Matt. Matt, how you doing out there, buddy?
Oh, pal, I'm doing so great. So great here. I mean, we have made it to round 3. Why would I leave now? This has been an
Why would you
episode
leave?
I've been bugging you about doing for the longest time.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, it just wasn't, I don't know why I never got it scheduled, but now I'm correcting that wrong, and I'm excited that I am. So this is a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying what we're tasting here tonight so far. I'm just gonna throw this little caveat out there. The next one, I'm a little cautious. I'm a little nervous about, but I'm going into it with an open attitude, an open heart. so we'll see what happens. But hey, we are the Bourbon Life Podcast presented by VisitLEX. I do need to say that, and we appreciate their sponsorship, and we appreciate all of our sponsors. But with that said, Matt, do you want to tell everybody who we have with us tonight?
I'd love to. He is the co-founder and distiller of Kings County Distillery in Brooklyn, New York. Colin Spoelman, welcome back for our final round this morning, this evening, this afternoon, whatever it is you are listening to the Bourbon Life Podcast.
Thank you, Matt.
I thought Matt was drunk. I'm like, this morning. I'm like, Matt, no,
No, I'm bringing it around.
buddy,
Yeah.
Matt, buddy, it's evening. I don't know what you're doing, but he's had too much Kings County tonight. But anyway,
Talking as the perspective of our audience.
Yes, that's very gracious. Yes, very kind of you to do that, Matt. So, Colin, this round, would you like to tell everybody what we have poured up for the third and final round here?
Sure. So this is peated bourbon. Everybody's heard of wheated bourbon. Well, maybe not everybody, but if you've gone down the bourbon road a little bit, you have encountered wheated bourbon, which is just bourbon that's made with wheat as a flavor grain. This is bourbon made with malted barley that's been exposed to peat smoke as a flavor grain. So this is 75% corn, 25% peated malted barley. So just to back up, what is malt? What is peat? Barley is a grain that grows, and in order to prepare it for distilling, distillers will malt it, or maltsters will malt it, which means they set it out to germinate for about a week, and then they dry it in a kiln, and then they can grind it up and use it to make whiskey, as it has good enzymes that will convert starch to sugar. Peated malt, in areas of Scotland where they had no trees, they would just really harvest this kind of almost fossilized turf, this grass that they could cut into bricks and then burn it in their fireplace and use it to heat their homes or to heat their malting kilns. And so it's a very traditional form of malting that is used for some of the Islay distilleries, some of the Highland distilleries. And so we use it. We had access to it through a brewery supply company that was just happened to have some peated malt. And I said, let's use it for what it was intended for. Let's make peated single malt whiskey. And so we were doing that, and then we ran out of the Golden Promise, the regular English malted barley that we use for our bourbon. And so the distiller on duty, Rob, was sort of like, let me use this peated malt to make the bourbon. And I said, it's got a ring to it. Let's see. And so peated bourbon was born that day. And Though it lightly peated. I could hear your trepidation, and most people, when they hear peat, they think of Lafroig or Ardbeg in there.
Yeah.
Unless they're very enthusiastic about peat, it's sort of a turnoff. But this is a very subtle peated whiskey, and it's bourbon, young bourbon. The peat gives it a little complexity, a little just unusual finish that
Sure.
is a little bit reminiscent of a Scotch whiskey, but it is mostly a bourbon.
Now, Colin, here's the funny thing. When I was opening the bottles that you guys sent earlier today, just to open them, let them get a little air to it and everything, I got a little bit of this on my hands. So I just kind of rubbed it in and gave it a whiff. And honestly, I don't know if you've ever had like Planters almonds that are, they call them like the smokehouse. They're like smoked, salted almonds. That was the initial aroma that I got. It was just, it took me a second to kind of place it, those memory banks. I'm thinking, where have I smelled this and what aroma, what does it remind me of? And that was what I came up, which I love. I mean, I used to love eating. Of course, the salt's terrible for me, but regardless, they're always delicious. So that at least gave me the openness to say, hey, you know what? Even though it's peated, it reminds me of these delicious smokehouse almonds. So there's going to be something to this, right? So, so I'm curious with the peated bourbon, what kind of response have you received from people? What's been the overall response on this?
Well, it is very regional in a way because, and I think the place where it has the least reception is Kentucky because
unfortunately, I'm not surprised to hear that. Unfortunately,
but also Kentucky understands it in a certain way better than anyone else because Kentucky is a more educated audience when it comes to whiskey. So it does well in Texas because Texas has its own sort of kind of barbecue-esque, sort of highly aged
mesquite
very
wood,
barrel forward whiskeys. Really just oak derived, but just a lot of oak,
Oh yeah.
And when people are really, as we have in New York, where we have a very the Scotch can whether you're a bourbon drinker or a Scotch drinker is more of a question. There just are more Scotch drinkers in New York. This has found a pretty cool home, but more than that, I think it really lands with whiskey nerds, which if you've tried everything, once you've tried through the Sazerac portfolio, like where do you go from there?
Sure.
You've had everything. You've been, so yes, you could wait for the latest release of yet another stag, which is probably worth waiting for, but what do you have when you can't get that? And so this is kind of a fun way to really get outside of the box of bourbon. But still be in the bourbon box. I mean, legally it meets all the requirements. It's bourbon, but it is bourbon that has a different element than people are used to.
Yeah, definitely. Very interesting. I'm going to throw it to Matt, like I always do, though. Let's talk about nosing notes, Matt. What do you pick up on the nose on this one?
So I think, like you, Mark, I was a little not hesitant, but expecting kind of to be like blown out of the show here with a big, huge peated nose and make it smell like just a field of turf. But the peated aspect of it is really, really light and fairly subtle. I'm finding on this, it does have kind of that smoky, kind of grassy aroma. I think, Mark, your subtle notes of barbecue are definitely there. I think that's a great descriptor. But I'm picking up, it almost has like some kind of briny type notes, like kind of seaside sort of notes to it. There's a sweetness that I just can't put my finger on, like that's there, almost like not like a cereal sweetness, but there's something really sweet and inviting with it as well. But a nice smoky factor to it as well. It's just fun. It's with a pot still whiskey or pot still bourbon here. It's changing through time, and
Hmm.
even in
Hmm. Hmm.
the 5 minutes we've had it poured up here, it's changed and really opened up more. So I'll be excited to see in another 5 minutes what it smells like.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good point, Matt. I'm very when I nosed it initially, I was thinking, okay, what am I going to get? Is it going to be this overly peaty? And it's not. Those bourbon notes come through, that sweetness comes through, but then I do detect that slight smokiness at the end. There's not. It's not just that over medicinal type of aroma that a lot of people maybe associate with peat. I don't get that at all. So yeah, it's very, very inviting, and we'll talk about the palate here in just a few minutes. But such an interesting experiment or project just to do. So, I mean, as a craft distillery, I mean, do you consider that to be one of your pluses, one of the benefits or bonuses of being craft, that you have this opportunity to do those types of experiments like that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've always felt like bourbon was very tradition bound, and so tradition bound that everybody was making more or less the same product. I mean, yes, I could sit in front of 5 different Kentucky bourbons and I can differentiate them, but I couldn't in a blind setting say, well, this is Bullet and this is Four
Right.
Roses and this is, they're just similar enough that you'd be very hard pressed to pick them out. Maker's Mark maybe you could pick out because it is, so
Yeah.
different in the sense that it's wheated and maybe a little lighter in profile.
Yeah.
But so I just felt like, and that is also the fun of being a distiller is, I say being a distiller, I'm hosting a team of people who are all creative, who all have good ideas. And so when Rob came up with the suggestion, it was both Rob's idea to make the whiskey, but then our idea to sort of embrace the whiskey. And Nicole Austin, who was our first blender,
Oh yeah. Right.
she kind of was the first person to sort of get to taste the whiskey and say, hey, there's actually something to this. Let's, commit to this and make this a product. So, it's a team of people. It's somebody to make the whiskey, somebody to taste and appreciate the whiskey, somebody to kind of market and highlight the whiskey and for its virtues. And then all the other people that go down the chain too. I mean, it's a wholesaler and a retailer that have to end up sort of convincing the end consumer to buy it by the time they do. So it's a long process of people who have to care about the whiskey for it to get actually into somebody's, onto somebody's liquor shelf.
Yeah. Back in round two, I mean, we're talking about the distillery, starting the distillery, being there in the Navy Yard in Brooklyn. But can you talk about the fact that you're actually distilling in Brooklyn? I mean,
Right.
you are in New York. I mean, when you say
Yeah.
New York, you don't typically say, "Oh, yeah, that's where they make whiskey."
Right.
So
No,
can you-
and yes, it was like a hurdle in the early days because there was that there was just this perception that there could be nothing that whiskey is Americana and whiskey belongs to the heartland, and New York is the opposite of that. And what business do you have, participating in this thing that belongs to the heartland? And I guess whatever. Like as a Kentuckian, I guess I just said, I kind of was like, I don't know how, like these are global corporations that have co-opted the heartland, and I don't know how much heartland is really in
yeah,
many of these brands. And that bourbon was really ripe for reinvention, and that is reinvention by us, but reinvention by all the people in Kentucky who are reinventing it too. I mean, I just think it's an exciting time for bourbon, but I don't know if it's an exciting time for bourbon because, Elijah Craig has added a toasted barrel. Like I think there's a lot more going on than what's happening from the sort of mainstream brands, and that's really exciting. But as to what makes Brooklyn any different, Brooklyn is definitely a place where people are very there's a very healthy sort of craft foodie scene. People don't necessarily they're encouraging of the sort of small scale production and the creativity that goes into that. They're supportive of their neighbors. It does feel like a community in a weird way. I mean, it's the largest city in the United States, but the whiskey community in New York is much smaller than the whiskey community in Kentucky. So it does become a little bit of and again, the nightlife is just so rich in New York that there's so many more opportunities to drink whiskey, that it becomes really great. And so then to bring people who maybe have never been to a distillery, won't have the budget to get to Kentucky to visit those Kentucky distillers, we get to sort of introduce people to whiskey production, and to do that at a very high level, in a very meaningful way, and really articulate what differentiates pot still from a column still, why we do it this way. But I think being, sort of generous enough not to necessarily say this is the only way to make whiskey, but this is the way that we make whiskey, I think really does, serve our audience, and that is really important. And our audience is, one of the nice things about New York is it's a big media market, and so a lot of people who are writing about whiskey and talking about whiskey, there's some of that in New York, there's some of that in Kentucky, and so there's this great sort of exchange that happens. And so I think if you can't make whiskey in Kentucky, the next best place
is New York,
is Brooklyn.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and there are different places. There are, several distilleries up there, right? I mean, there's you guys. Widow Jane is right there in Brooklyn as well, right? And then who else is?
Yeah, New York is a very favorable legal environment for distilling, so that creates a lot of interest. There's certainly, obviously, a huge audience for just alcohol, so that makes it a fortuitous environment. And but also within that, like people who are, it's a big environment for alcohol, but a big environment for the kinds of people who are going to sit through a 3 or 4 course dinner and really want to appreciate what they're consuming, and not necessarily be rushed through it. There's a lot of that happens in New York, and that's really great.
Very cool.
That's really good for us.
And one thing I wanted to ask you, because we've got the bottles here. These are the 200s, but I'm looking over your shoulder. I mean, you've got bottles there that, they're just different sizes, but they're all the same. They got the silver tops on them and the little white labels. Can you talk about your bottles and your design, your labeling, how that came about? And
sure. Well, anybody who's watching the video will see this. This is like the moonshine that I was making in the early days. Nice. And my business partner was like, this is too, like, nobody's going to drink that. Looks too scary. So we got the flask bottles. The other thing about New York is that, when you go to the liquor store, you have to carry it from the liquor store back to your apartment, which can be like 3-4 blocks. So the smaller the bottle, the better. So there was really, by coming out with 200s and 375s, we really sort of met the audience in our core territory in a way that it took us 9 years before we came out with a 750. And so that was very helpful, just in terms of the product size to begin with, but also, to keep it very understated. I mean, we didn't want to pretend to be a bigger distillery than we were, and wanted to keep it sort of minimalist, because there's not a lot of spirits brands that are minimalist, and to really keep our story different from the prevailing story of we've been around for generations, and this is the way great grandpappy used to do it, and that's not us. Like, that's not the story that we have to tell. So let's figure out what's the packaging that reinforces that. And so it's not the individual package, but when you see them all together, you're like, oh, this is about creativity and about variety and about, just really squeezing the idea of American whiskey and seeing what comes out of that.
And to me, I mean, here's the cool thing, just, being from Kentucky as well. And, you showed the mason jar. Obviously these aren't mason jars, but they're almost like an upscale, differentiated version of the mason jar. They're simplistic in what they show. They're stylish, but it's kind of that same thought process. So it's almost like homage to me, I don't know if you intended that, but almost to that kind of heritage, So I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's subconscious, and I think it is. I mean, I do have a lot of respect for the backwoods moonshiner.
Sure.
And I think that's like, if there's anybody who's really keeping American distilling alive, I don't know if it's. I mean, it is Brown-Forman, yes, but it is also that guy who's up in the woods. He's not able to do it because he doesn't have a license, and he's selling it, $50 for a gallon jug of it to friends and neighbors.
Yeah.
I think both of those traditions are very important to keep in mind, and to, never forget the other side of it,
Very, very good point. Matt, let's jump back to the whiskey, the peated bourbon. Who would have ever thunk it?
Yeah, let's do it.
Tell me, what do you pick up? The tasting notes.
So first we were talking about coming back to the nose on it again after it had sat out, and it's gotten really creamy. The nose has picked up a lot of cream, a little more cinnamon. Just it's changed in body and really, really opened up more on the nose. But on the palate, I get a nice sweetness, like a sweet honeysuckle, kind of springtime floral nose on it. It's like a light grass type flavor, and kind of that comes across as well. A little bit of the corn through it too. Not much of the cereal grain that we had before, but I get a really nice long warm finish. It's not overly spicy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like one note of like just cinnamon that's kind of hot and blows you out, but just a really nice warm long finish that continues all the way through the palate.
Yeah. Matt, here's something. I'm going to say two things about it. One, all right, three things. One, I actually like it. So go figure. This may be the first peated product, Colin, that I've actually been able to drink. And I actually just poured myself a little more of it because, yeah, I know that's a big statement right there. But number two, Matt, you were talking about that heat a little bit. It reminds me, we've talked about a few times in the past where we've had a whiskey, a bourbon, that kind of reminds us a little bit maybe of like a jalapeno, where you get a little bit of a kind of that creeper heat from it. This to me is almost like someone has put the jalapeno on the grill and smoked it, and got a nice char on it. So you can still get a little bit of that heat, but it's caramelized as well. So you get that sweetness that comes from the pepper, but you also still get a little bit of that heat. But you get that smoky barbecue kind of flavor as well. Kind of a really cool mix of flavor, at least for me. And then the third thing, I bought a bottle of some artisanal mezcal a few months ago. And there's that reminiscent because, they've got to smoke that in however they do the piñas and everything. So reminiscent of that smoking process as well with this peat. It's not overwhelming. It's not that medicinal that I get sometimes on a heavy peat. So yeah, very nice. Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, if there's any spirit anywhere in the world that's really keeping the sort of authenticity that used to define American moonshine or American whiskey pre-prohibition, I feel like mezcal really, you still have small producers. It's still very agricultural.
Yeah.
It's becoming more industrialized, but isn't yet by any means. And so, that's in a way very high praise to me. So,
okay.
So I'll take it.
All right. Very, very cool.
Nice.
Well, we're actually close to the end of round 3 here already, believe it or not. Kind of crazy. Matt, I know you wish we could go on for another hour and a half.
Well, we'll just have to have him back for another.
We'll have a round 2.
Yeah.
Second episode.
Yeah. So the 3 that we've tasted tonight, we had the blended, we had the straight, and we also had the peated. Those are three of your flagships. Is that correct? Is that okay? But then you also do some other products, and you were kind enough to send us other samples as well. We didn't get to taste them on the show, but I know Matt and I will taste them. Matt's a huge Empire Rye fan.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah. So that the bottled and bond, and then you also send it the cast strength or the barrel proof or barrel.
The barrel strength.
Barrel strength.
These three, I mean, it's worth just mentioning them before we wrap, just because these are 3 whiskeys that are in pretty limited supply. They're anywhere from 150 to 300 cases that go around the country, and they represent, in the case of barrel strength, the best high proof whiskey we have. In terms of bottled and bond, it's become our age dated whiskey, the one that's the oldest and the finest. And then the Empire Rye has always been really the heritage of New York is rye whiskey. And even though I'm a bourbon guy and I'm from Kentucky and bourbon is mostly what sells, I think we make a great weird bourbon that's cool. I think we make one of the best ryes that you can find on the market, and I think that has to do with the fact that we're just in, that's our grain heritage, and and we just, part of it was just doing it, and I think a lot of people have never really had rye whiskey unless they've had a pot stilled Northeastern rye, and there's not that much of it that gets out of the Northeast. So if you can ever find any of those three whiskeys, I stand by all of them. I love them each in different ways. Obviously I like all the whiskeys that we make, but these three are, because they're more limited and a little bit pulled from the smallest and the rarest sort of bit of the warehouse. They're fun for sure.
Well, Colin, there is a question I love to ask our guests. So I have to ask you, what has been the best part of this journey for you? Is there any one thing that you can say has been the best part of this journey for you?
Well, I'll say in two ways. One, there's no joy other than opening a barrel. I mean, that's like, the joy of the consumer is opening a bottle, the joy of a distiller is opening a barrel, because you just never know what it's going to be, and it could be great, it could be not great, but there's just always that promise of like the next one and the older one, and we're starting to get into 8 and 9 year age dated whiskeys, which is really exciting for us. So, what promise those barrels hold is, definitely an outsized portion of my mental energy around the distillery, because it's just, it's stuff that I made when I was a kid. 9 years ago was a long time ago, and I was a very different person, unmarried, had no family, was like just starting this little tiny business. And so the meaning that those older whiskeys have to me is very profound, and it's very cool to get into those older whiskeys. But I will also say that the pleasure of this business is that we just live in a wild times, and the ability of whiskey to bring people together is unmatched. And I mean, I don't know that many other ways in which people get so enthusiastic about meeting strangers online or sharing bottles, but the whiskey community is very deep in ways that I think we all understand because we're in it. But that's been a great discovery of mine, just getting to know consumers, fans, other distillers, blenders, retailers, anybody who's got an interest or a stake in the industry, anybody who just loves whiskey. It's a fun sort of hobby, but calling it a hobby sounds very reductive. It's a fun, I don't know, the kind of
lifestyle. It's the bourbon life.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a fun way to interpret and appreciate the world, and that is through human beings, which don't always get talked about when we talk about whiskey, but an important piece.
Very, very good. I like that. So, just curious in terms of things coming up, anything big coming up, anything you want to share with our listeners that they need to be on the lookout for?
Well, we did just release a coffee whiskey, which is just a bourbon whiskey that's been proofed down with cold brew. So, every whiskey is proofed down with water. What if you proof down whiskey with something else? It's a very delicious, cool whiskey. I mean, obviously not necessarily to the straight bourbon single barrel connoisseur, but totally wild and totally cool, and just came out in New York. Be making its way around the country soon.
Nice.
But yeah, that's an example of one of those things that, like, as much as we do focus on that 9 year, we're also busy making a cold brew whiskey that is totally delicious. And so look out for that one.
I'll definitely be on the lookout. That's the way I run my day. Before noon or 1 o'clock, it's all It's all Americanos, After 1:00, it's all bourbon. So
right. So this is your
That's right. Yeah.
transition beverage.
yeah, there you go. It's the perfect beverage for Mark. That's awesome. Oh, Colin. So people want to find out more information or come and visit you guys. How can they do that?
Best way is kingscountydistillery.com. Also, I'll say our Twitter handle is Kings Co Whiskey, and Instagram is at Kings County Distillery. We usually put various different. I'll say the Instagram is probably more helpful than the website because that's got all the fun like little news and updates and when we're having DJs at the Gatehouse, our tasting room. But we have this beautiful tasting room in New York. So if anybody ever comes to visit, we're in this 1896 castle that was you could get flights and cocktails and all the whiskeys that we make in a sort of cocktail setting. That's really great. Obviously, best is to take a tour because then you get behind the scenes. But if you don't have time for that, our Gatehouse the tasting room's open every day from 2 to 10 and longer on weekends.
Awesome. That's great. So, all right. Well, we're at the end of round 3 here. I'm going to throw this out there. My favorite is the Peated Bourbon. I'm just going to throw it out there. I never would have imagined in my lifetime that I would have said that. But yes, it is so good. Just that combination of the sweetness from the corn, but that smokiness. There's something about it.
Yeah.
I'm really impressed with this one. I'm not that I wasn't with the other two, but this one obviously is like a complete 180 from what I thought it was potentially going to be, Colin. So very cool. Final thoughts though, before we wrap it up, anything else before we get out of here?
No, other than just, if people do, come visit us, I mean, that's most people will find themselves in New York one way or another for business or for fun or for, I don't know, layover. So for that reason, we're very conveniently located. You can take the taxi between the flights and come to the distillery and check it out. That's always a great experience. Or if you find us, always helps to talk about us online. We don't have a marketing budget. We don't have, we are a truly independent small business. And so it helps when people, if they like us, it's helpful to talk about it.
Very, very cool. Well, Matt, before we wrap it up and send it home, anything you want to add tonight? Hey,
Colin, thanks for taking the time, sit down with us and with our listeners and go through everything that you all are doing. We really appreciate your time this evening. And this has been well worth the wait to get you on here to have this episode. So thank you very much. Super impressed with everything that you all are putting out. And I'll keep checking my emails because I'm a subscriber. So
yeah, good. Great. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I just poured my 3rd round of the Peated bourbon. I'm telling you,
good. Yeah.
It's really, really good. So I better wrap it up though, before I tear into that 3rd pour. So Colin, we appreciate you being with us tonight. I've really enjoyed this. It's great to have, we're from Kentucky, obviously we're here in Lexington. So we're fans of the legacy, obviously the heritage distillers, but we also appreciate and respect the fact that there are so many people out there that are following their dreams, doing the things they wanted to do, and distilling on their own terms. And you're definitely one of those people that is someone like me who spent a lifetime as an attorney wishing he could do something else. I mean, honestly, that's seriously, it's inspirational. And I think it's great that you've taken the initiative to do that and really started, 2010, 13 years, not a long time in terms of overall distilling, but definitely a long time in terms of craft distilling. So really appreciate what you're putting out. Appreciate your transparency, your creativity, the expressions that you're doing. It's a lot of fun and have really enjoyed getting to sample through what you have. Now I understand why Matt was so adamant about getting you on the show. Happy we did that, and we will not wait 3 years to do that again. I can assure you of that. But with that said, I do need to tell everybody, of course, we are the Bourbon Life Podcast presented by VisitLEX. We appreciate their sponsorship and support. We appreciate the support of all of our sponsors. We also appreciate you, our listeners. As Matt said, whatever time of day it is, the morning, afternoon, evening, night, whatever. We appreciate you taking the time to spend some time with us and listen to our podcast and the stories of all these wonderful people like Colin who are in the industry doing what they love. So if you want to email us, please do so at thebourbonlife@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram at thebourbonlife and on Facebook, Join our private Facebook group at the Bourbon Lifers. We'd love to have you guys in there as well. And if you feel so inclined, leave us a review, as long as it's a positive one on Apple Podcast. But with that said, I'm going to wrap it up. Send us home with our tagline, which is, may your glasses always be full, and may you keep on living the bourbon life.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the Bourbon Life Podcast. Our mission at the Bourbon Life is simple: to share our passion for all things bourbon with you every week. And we'd really love to hear your thoughts on how we're doing. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at The Bourbon Life. You can also contact us by email at thebourbonlife@gmail.com. And you can always find us on your favorite podcast platform. If you have a moment, we'd love it if you would rate us and give us a review. So until next week, we hope your glass is always full and that you keep on living the bourbon life.